They still tell it like a courthouse whisper, a true story, names worn smooth by the prairie wind but the bones of it left intact. Out on the flats west of Red Hollow, where sage breaks the light into 1,000 silver knives, a young widow tried to keep a cabin standing with nothing but grit, a limp prayer, and a ring she should have buried long ago. Her name was Tess Calder, 24, brown-eyed, too thin from a winter that had teeth. The town called her unfit in the way towns do when they need a target more than a truth. The men said her husband died owing them and her smile owed them too. The women said she'd been born to trouble and that trouble had learned her name by heart. No one said it to her face. They let the dust do the talking, how it found her dress hem, her food stores, her lungs, and they watched to see if she'd cough or cry. She did neither. The symbol of what she'd lost hung on a rawhide thong she kept looped at her waist like a tool, her bent wedding ring, blackened at one edge where lightning struck the cottonwood that had once shaded their porch. The tree split, the porch slumped, and the ring, knocked free from her swollen finger the day they dragged her husband's body home, had rolled into the soot like it was trying to end itself. She'd picked it up hot, skin blistering, and wore the scar where gold kissed flesh too hard. Folks saw that ring when she came to town and said it meant she was clinging to a ghost. Some folks like their women grateful to air and men alike, the storekeeper's wife liked to say, handing Tess flour with 2 fingers like mercy had a cent. Across those same streets rode Jonah Hart, a rancher with a spread so quiet coyotes forgot to bother it. He was a long man, shoulders gone a little to slope from years of fences and silence. People called him lonely not because he was alone but because he wore it clean, like a shirt he'd mended too often to pretend it was new. The war had missed him, sorrow had not. He'd courted once, there was a grave up on Hart Mesa that told the rest, and he came to town only for salt blocks, nails, and the way the bell over the store door proved the world still made small sounds. The day their stories braided, sky was the color of an old bruise. Wind had shifted, bringing the stink of a dry creek and the rumor of a storm too high to help anybody. Tess had traded eggs for coffee and was stepping off the porch with her brown paper parcels when the porch step gave with a splinter's cough. Her ankle turned and she took most of the fall with her hip, the packages letting go of themselves like doves startled into flight. The coffee bag burst, the smell rose up rich and far away, a whole other country spilling into the dust. The men on the bench outside the barber shop watched the way men watch a dropped hat in the street, curious if it'll blow back or keep going. One spat into a knot of sunlight and said, "Seems Providence keeps her humble." Another laughed, quiet and mean. Jonah didn't laugh. He was tying a salt block to his saddle and he paused, one hand on the rope, as if listening for a sound only he could hear. Then he crossed the street slow. The dust made a small halo around his boots. He squatted, picked up what the coffee hadn't swallowed, and set the paper whirled back together with hands that knew how to fix a fence without waking a foal. "You all right?" His voice had gravel in it, the kind the creek leaves after spring takes the water back. Tess kept her eyes on the spilled coffee, because looking up was its own kind of exposure. "All right enough." He nodded like that was a fine answer, like he'd use it himself. He gathered the torn bag into a clean handkerchief he produced from somewhere honest, white once, washed 100 times, and tied it off with a neat twist. He didn't look at the ring, didn't let his gaze snag on the burn scar she kept unhidden. Respect can be as loud as an insult if you don't get it offered much. The space he gave her felt like a blanket she wasn't sure she deserved. "Porch steps rotten," he said, examining the split board with the toe of his boot. "It belonged to better feet once," she answered before she could stop herself. His mouth made almost a smile, only the idea of it. "I can bring a plank by. Got a few that don't mind working another life." She stiffened. Help could be a debt dressed as a gift. In Red Hollow, debts came with gossip tied to them like tin to a stray dog's tail. "I'll manage." "Most folks do," he said, not leaving. "Doesn't make a new board less useful." The barber's laugh broke again from across the way. "Careful there, Hart. That one's got a way of making men feel needed until they aren't." Tess felt the words land like cinders. She reached for the parcels, jaw tight, the ring at her hip tapping once against the button of her dress, a small, hollow knock that sounded like blame. Jonah didn't turn to the barber. He didn't posture or spit or take the bait. He only shifted so his hat threw a longer shade over Tess, taking the sun off her face the way a man might move to stop rain finding a child. "You want the board," he said to her, "not the town. Hang a strip of flour sack on your fence post by the road. If you don't, I'll forget this ever needed saying." He placed the handkerchief bundle of coffee in her palm, and the warmth of him, a clean sweat, horse, cedar from a saddle box, folded around the moment and made it steadier than it had any right to be. She didn't thank him in front of them. Pride is a thin quilt, but it covers the heart. She gave a short nod and walked away with the straightest back she had left, even though her ankle sang protest and the ground pitched like a skiff on a lake nobody remembered naming. That night the wind came up from the south, smelling of wood that wouldn't arrive. Tess lit her lamp and set the bent ring on the table where the flame could think about it. The burned scar it had given her years ago pulsed once, and memory has its own pulse, and she worked the rawhide thong loose the way you coax a scared colt to trust the halter. Outside, coyotes spoke in questions and answers. Inside, the cabin's beams creaked like old men when they stand. She didn't hang the flour sack strip. She told herself it was because she didn't want a board from a man she didn't know. The truer part was this: she didn't want the town to see anything tying her to anyone but herself. Before sleep, she opened the door to breathe the night. The sky was a dark iron kettle, stars pulled like sparks you couldn't stamp out. Far down the dirt road, a shape moved, a rider and horse smudged into one ink stroke. He didn't turn up her lane. He just paused at the junction, glanced once toward her fence post, and rode on with the patience of a man who could wait out weather and rumor both. At dawn, when she went out to see what the storm had not delivered, she found a new pine plank leaning against her gate, plain smooth and smelling like a mountain she wasn't ever going to climb. No note. Just the work. 2 nails sat on top like eyes considering her. She looked down the road. The dust held no story. She stood there a while with the plank and the ring heavy as iron on her hip. The town would make a tale out of this if it ever learned of it, how the lonely rancher found himself a project to mend, how the widow traded favors for wood. But there was no one staring, no crows to carry gossip. Tess set her jaw and lifted the board herself, ribs aching the way ribs ache when you've talked yourself out of crying too many months in a row. Inside, she boiled coffee that tasted like a far coast and watched steam ghost the glass. The ring sat beside the cup. She touched the blackened edge with a finger and pulled away fast, though it had been cold for years. The scar along her finger woke like a snake in winter sunlight. Not today, she told the ring. Not yet. By mid-morning, she'd set the new plank into the porch frame, hammering slow and even, each strike a measured yes against the rot. Down in the cottonwoods, a hawk made a high thin whistle. Up the road, the same rider appeared again. He kept his distance, tipped his hat, passed on. She watched him go and felt something she'd outlawed in herself rise and settle like a cautious bird returning to a fence post that once broke under its own weight. It wasn't hope. Hope is noisy. This was quieter. A small room in her chest she hadn't swept in a while, opening its window to see if the air outside had changed. They'll say later the man made the widow pregnant and the town made it mean something it wasn't, but that's for other sections. Here, at the start, all we have is a board, a ring, and a man who didn't look away when looking away would have been easier. Shadows lengthened. The porch step held. The cabin breathed. And at the edge of the world, 2 lives had already taken one step closer, though neither would admit it to God or themselves. The first real test came 3 weeks later, under a sky stitched with lightning. Spring storms in Red Hollow didn't arrive with warning, they cracked the world open like an axe to dry wood. Tess had gone to draw water before dusk, skirts tucked, the bent ring knocking against her hip like it had something left to say. She had just filled the pail when her mare, tied near the cottonwoods, spooked at thunder. The rope snapped, hooves tore mud, and in a blink the animal bolted up the ridge, reins slapping wild. The water spilled, Tess dropped the bucket and ran, heart hammering against her ribs. She shouted, voice thin against the storm, chasing boots into sucking earth. But the mare was faster, her only wealth tearing itself away into the black mouth of rain. From the rise, a rider appeared, a dark coat, hat pulled low, horse steady under sheets of water. Jonah Hart. He didn't call her name, maybe he wasn't sure she'd answer. He just spurred his gelding after the runaway. Mud sprayed, hooves pounded like drums. Tess stood at the edge of the field, soaked through, watching 2 shapes blow into storm. It wasn't long, though it felt endless. Lightning cracked, showing horse and man in studded frames, Jonah leaning low, rope in hand, his scar lit pale as bone. Then the sound, sharp, final, with the lasso snapping true. When they came back down the slope, the mare blew hard, trembling but caught, Jonah's rope holding fast. His hat was gone, hair plastered to his brow, eyes burning in the rain. He swung down and placed the reins into Tessa's shaking hands. "You'll want to check her hoof tomorrow," he said, voice flat but kind. Her fingers brushed his as she took them. She felt the tremor in his hand, not from fear but from the strain of holding too much weight alone for too long. She wanted to thank him, but the words were lodged behind pride and a throat full of stormwater. Instead she whispered, "You didn't have to." "Maybe I did," Jonah said, stepping back into the downpour, his face unreadable as stone. The mare's flank pressed against her, warm even in the cold. The bent ring at her hip clinked once against the wet buckle, and for the first time Tess wondered if it was shifting from curse to witness. The town would never know of this moment. But Tess knew. And so did Jonah. Storm season left the ground heavy, but gossip dries faster than mud. By June, the whole town had something to chew, the widow Calder and the lonely rancher Hart was seen. It started with the coffee bag. A storehand claimed Tess had been given more beans than she paid for, on account of a man's handkerchief tied up with it. Others said Jonah's gelding had been tied too near her lane too often. A boy swore he'd seen a pine plank leaning against her fence, fresh as a wedding gift. And so the town sharpened its teeth. At the blacksmith's, men spat tobacco and smirked. Funny how some women bury a husband but keep on needing one. At the well, women clucked their tongues. She's young enough to tempt, old enough to know better. Even the preacher's wife lowered her eyes when Tess passed, muttering, "Sin has a way of dressing itself in need." Tess bore it the way she bore the burn scar at her finger, tender when pressed, invisible otherwise. But inside, she felt the lash of every whispered word. She knew what they were saying, that she would trade her body for boards, her honor for a rope, her womb for a name not her own. The bent ring at her hip felt heavier with each rimmer. It was no longer only her shame, it was becoming their evidence. One afternoon, carrying eggs to market, Tess passed the saloon. A man leaning on the rail called, "Best keep those eggs from cracking, widow. Don't want another mouth to feed before winter." His laughter pealed out, cruel and hot. She froze, nails biting the basket's handle, blood rising to her cheeks. For a heartbeat she wanted to throw the eggs at him, watch yolk run down his smirk. But pride held her still. She walked on, back straight, every step another stitch against tearing. What she didn't see was Jonah Hart, across the street, halting mid-step. He'd heard it all. His hand flexed at his side like it remembered the heft of a rifle. But he didn't cross. Not yet. He watched her walk, shoulders rigid, and something in him ached with the weight of silence. That night, he rode by her cabin. No words, no knock. Just the shape of him in the distance, hat brim catching moonlight. Tess watched from behind the thin curtain, the bent ring cold against her thigh. For the first time, she wondered if the town's whispers could burn hotter than the truth. And in that wondering, she realized, what scared her most wasn't their judgment. It was that he might believe it too. Summer hadn't been kind, storms turned the creek to mud, and heat baked it dry again before crops could drink. Tess had stacked tinder too close to the hearth, meaning to carry it outside at dusk. But dusk came with her eyelids heavy, and she left the chore for morning. It was the crackle that woke her, too sharp, too eager. By the time she threw the blanket off, the tinder pile was lit, flames licking at the cabin wall. Smoke clawed her throat. She grabbed the bent ring at her hip, not knowing why, maybe because it had become habit when fear did. She coughed, stumbled, tried to beat the fire down with her apron, but the heat pushed back, greedy. The mare outside screamed in her pen. The cabin roof groaned. And then, boots at the door, shoulders breaking wood, Jonah Hart crashing through with his coat already off. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped Tess in the coat, shoved her toward the open air, then turned back into the smoke to tear the tinder pile apart. Sparks danced in his hair, flames biting for him, but he smothered them, cursing low and steady like a man talking down a drunk with a knife. When it was over, the cabin still stood, black scars on one wall, smoke curling like shame. Tess sat in the dirt, coughing until her ribs ached, the bent ring burning cold in her fist. Jonah knelt beside her, one hand on her back, the other holding her wrist as if to steady the pulse hammering wild beneath her skin. "You're alive," he said. "Not you're safe. Not it's over." Just the plainest truth, heavy as an oath. Her breath hitched. She looked at him, his face streaked with soot, scar glistening like a mark the fire itself had claimed years before. Her lips parted. No words came. Instead she pressed the bent ring into his palm, metal warm from her hand. "I should have let it burn with the tinder." Jonah closed his fist around it, slow. For a moment, the world was only their two hands, hers trembling, his rough but steady. He didn't keep the ring. He set it on the ground between them, like a truth too raw to pocket. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight, you breathe." And for the first time since widowhood had named her, Tess leaned into another's shoulder, not because she was weak, but because he'd proved she didn't have to be strong alone. The cabin wall still carried its black scar, but it stood. Tess carried her own black scar too, the burn from that bent ring, and the weight of all the words the town had hung on her shoulders. The morning after the fire, she found Jonah already outside, sleeves rolled, repairing the half-burnt boards with the same patience he used on a fence post or a frightened colt. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't distance, it was steadiness, an anchor when the wind wanted her gone. Tess sat on the stoop, the ring cupped in her palm. Bent, blackened at one edge, it had been her chain. The town pointed to it as proof she was still tied to a man long buried, still living under his shadow. She thought of the laughter at the saloon, the spit in the dirt when she passed. She thought of the way Jonah had risked his life in smoke without a second word. She closed her fingers tight until the metal bit her skin. And then, without announcing it, without prayer or ceremony, she walked to the fire pit outside. Jonah straightened, hammer in hand, watching but not asking. She knelt, laid the ring in the ash where embers still glowed, and pressed it down with a stick. For a moment the metal gleamed hot again, as if remembering. Then it dulled, sank into grey. Her hands shook. Not from fear, if fear was something she'd lived with too long, but from the strange, raw ache of release. She whispered to the wind, "It doesn't own me anymore." Jonah stepped closer. Not too close, just enough. His hand brushed her shoulder, light as breath. "Good," he said. One word, but it filled her chest more than any sermon could have. The town would still talk. They always would. But Tess had let go of the rope that bound her, and for the first time she felt what it meant to stand on her own ground, with someone steady beside her, and not in front, not behind. Beside. By harvest time, the whispers had grown too loud to stay whispers. The preacher called a meeting at the saloon, because in Red Hollow, men confessed their sins in one building and judged others in the one next to it. Tess was told to come. She arrived with her shawl tight, the bent ring long since burned, but its absence felt just as heavy. The room stank of lamp oil and sweat. Eyes followed her as though she carried plague. "Widow Calder," the preacher began, his voice low but meant to carry, "there's talk you found yourself in another man's shadow. A man who owes no vows to you." Murmurs rose. Shame. Temptress. Beggar of men. Tessa's throat closed. She wanted to say she had asked for nothing, that the boards, the rope, the fire saved, the mare caught, were not trades but mercies. But the words died. Pride was one thing, being heard was another. And then the door opened. Jonah Hart stepped in, boots steady, hat low. He didn't pause at the threshold. He crossed the room slow, until he stood beside Tess where every eye could see. For a breath, the world held still. Then he did something simple, something louder than fists or sermons. He reached down, calloused fingers brushing hers, and he held her hand. Not hidden. Not ashamed. Gasps scattered like startled birds. A few men cursed under breath. But no one moved. A child's voice broke the silence, the rancher's orphan girl Tess had been feeding in secret. She clutched her rag doll tight and piped clear as a bell, "She's not bad. She's my mama now." The preacher faltered. The crowd hushed. The lamp flames flickered. And Tess, with Jonah's hand firm around hers, felt the shift. Small, fragile, but real, a crack in the wall of judgment. Enough light to see by. Enough air to breathe. She lifted her chin. For once, she did not swallow the moment. The crowd did not bless them. But it did not break them either. Sometimes silence is the first form of surrender. After that night in the saloon, Tess found fewer doors closing in her face. The grocer's wife still pressed flour across the counter like it carried disease, but she no longer muttered. The barber no longer spat insults loud enough to land at her boots. And though the preacher never said her name again from the pulpit, he did not say sinner either. It wasn't approval. It was space. And Tess, for the first time in years, knew what to do with space. She and Jonah began to plant. At first it was simple, beans, corn, a stubborn patch of onions. But soon there were rows, neat and tended, the earth giving back what she had thought forever lost. She dug barefoot, nails rimmed with soil, her dress hem damp with dew. Jonah worked beside her, steady as stone, sleeves rolled to his elbows, silence as natural to him as breathing. One evening, after a long day setting fence posts, Tess found him kneeling by the rows. Not working, just watching the green tips poke through soil. His face, always lined like weathered oak, had softened. She stood a moment in the doorway, shawl around her shoulders, watching him the way a thirsty traveler watches a creek. "Never thought it'd take," he said without looking back. "Neither did I," she answered. And she wasn't speaking only of corn. That night, by the hearth, she sewed a tear in her dress while Jonah mended a bridle strap. Their shoulders brushed once. Neither pulled away. The cabin smelled of cedar shavings and stew cooling on the table. At some point, she set her work aside and reached, hesitant, her hand to his scar. Her fingers traced it, slow, reverent. His jaw tightened. His hand caught hers halfway, callous thumb brushing her palm as if asking, "Are you sure?" She nodded, a small breath breaking her lips. He kissed her palm, eyes closing, as though he'd been waiting years for the permission to rest. There were no vows spoken, no grand claims. Just two people scarred by loss, planting something fragile in soil they both knew was harsh. But the shoots were real. And real was enough. By midsummer, the garden grew wild with color. Beans curled around poles. Corn rustled in the wind like an old hymn. Children passing by on the road stared with round eyes, as though such abundance was a trick. But Tess knew it wasn't magic. It was labor. It was patience. It was choosing, every morning, not to leave. And that was love, in not lightning, not fire, but roots. By autumn, the garden bent heavy with yield. Corn stalks whispered, beans curled around poles, pumpkins swelled orange and round. Tess had never seen her land so full. She moved among the rows with her apron wide, gathering, the shawl slipping from her shoulders in the mild wind. Jonah was mending harness leather by the porch. He looked up often, though he pretended not to. She felt it, the weight of his gaze, in no longer pity, no longer loneliness seeking its echo, but a steady belonging. That night, they ate stew thick with the garden's work. The cabin smelled of herbs and wood smoke. After, Tess sat by the hearth sewing, Jonah carving a piece of cedar smooth. Silence wrapped them, not sharp but soft. At length, she set her work aside. The fire cast shadows over the scar on his jaw, the one she had once touched like a question. She leaned forward now and pressed her lips to it, a kiss without spectacle, without demand. His eyes closed. His breath left him like a man laying down a burden. Outside, the wind carried the sound of coyotes, but the cabin walls held warm. Later, as she banked the fire, Tess whispered, half to herself, "It stands." The cabin, the fence, the garden, the love, none grand, none perfect, but standing. Jonah's arms slipped around her waist. "Things stand," he murmured, "if two keep holding." And so they did. So if ever you find yourself listening to the prairie winds, remember Tess Calder and Jonah Hart, the widow with a burned ring turned to ash, the rancher with a scar kissed into peace. Remember the garden that grew where shame once lived. And ask yourself, what keeps a heart alive on the frontier? A kiss, a scar, or the memory of one hand that never let go?